Hey everyone, welcome back to our last installment of the Physio project. For this final week, we're going to be talking about resistance training and the different types of resistance training and why it's important to incorporate it into any exercise regime. All right, stay tuned. Before we discuss resistance training, we felt that it was important to very briefly talk about what's known as supercompensation. Now, supercompensation is essentially just a fancy way of saying adaptation of our bodies to various stressors or physical activities over time. So if we take this very simple curve, we'll use the blue line as our baseline, so that's when we're starting an exercise or a workout. As we progress throughout our workout, our body or our tissues is going to get broken down, and then we begin the recovery phase. So ideally in the recovery phase, this is where we want to be getting adequate sleep, nutrition, fluids, but we also want to make sure that this recovery process is an active recovery process, meaning that we don't want to be sitting on the couch for extended periods of time, even if it's something as simple as going for a walk, getting our heart rate up, getting the blood flowing to the muscles. So after the recovery phase, we're going to go into a phase of essentially what is adaptation or supercompensation. This is where the body adapts or changes in one way or another, for example, such as increasing the amount of muscle tissue that we have to adapt to whatever stress we applied on it. In this instance, resistance training. Now, when we reach this state of adaptation, that's when we want to be going through and following through with our next workout. That way we reset, so to speak, our baseline to this adapted phase, and then when we go to our next recovery phase and our next adaptation phase, we're going to be gradually increasing through whatever form of resistance training it is, whether it's strength, endurance, hypertrophy, etc. So building on this concept of adaptation or supercompensation and recovery, it's important to understand why it is we want to be making sure that we have adequate rest. So if we consider on this graph here, if I'm doing a large strength training workout where I'm using a large amount of musculature, it's going to be extremely taxing on the body. So we want to generally be resting for a greater period of time, closer to that 48-hour mark. In contrast to smaller muscle groups that we might be working, we can get closer to 24 hours. But as a general rule, anywhere between 24 and 48 hours, the more muscles or the more muscle groups that we're using, or the larger muscle groups, we want to be closer to that 48-hour range. So if we consider the supercompensation curve that we discussed earlier, timing of our workouts and timing of nutrition is extremely important because, as I mentioned earlier, we want to be timing our workouts with that point of supercompensation or adaptation. However, if we were to time our workout with when we were closer to the recovery phase, we are not going to be reaching this adaptation phase, and we might actually fall below our original baseline because it doesn't give us the opportunity to recover enough and adapt enough. So if we continue this negative cycle of not getting enough recovery, we can actually start off worse than we originally started. So if we consider supercompensation now, or the first point of adaptation, as our original baseline, we can continue from there, and firstly, we probably won't get as tired as we originally did if we're working with the same amount of weights. But in most instances, we generally want to be increasing or progressively overloading our body so as to promote this cycle of adaptation. And so if we start with our new baseline, we're gradually going to be increasing, and we'll be working through an upward trend, whether it's through strength, muscle growth, or muscle endurance. When we talk about resistance training, there's generally four categories or four types of resistance training that we discuss. There's endurance training, there's strength, there's hypertrophy, and there's therapeutic exercise. And each of these different categories has different intensities, or the amount of weight that one is working with, the amount of time in between each set, and the total number of sets. Now, when we speak of resistance training in general, it's extremely important, especially in older populations, not only to maintain what muscle mass there is, but it also applies a lot of tension to the bone, and specifically with men or women who are prone to osteoporosis, if we're loading the bones for extended periods of time, that's going to help to promote bone health and help to preserve what bone we have. So now we're going to be discussing the four types or four categories of resistance training. Now, the first type of resistance training that we're going to be discussing is therapeutic exercise. Therapeutic exercise is generally done with very low intensity weights, and it's done really for the purposes of training movement patterns before progressing to heavier weights. It's particularly important during rehabilitation or when someone is just starting out exercising. Therapeutic exercise is generally done for about 5 sets and 5 reps per set, so that usually equates to about 25 total movements. So for example, if someone's doing therapeutic exercise for a squat, they'll be doing quite low intensity or low weight, and they'll be doing about 25 reps for that exercise. Hypertrophy is the second type of resistance training that we're going to be discussing. In contrast to therapeutic exercise, hypertrophy is very important for increasing or maintaining muscle mass. So you'll typically be transitioning from a therapeutic exercise to a hypertrophy style program once you get used to moving weights. Generally speaking, the load is moderate and the amount of repetitions that you're going to be doing for an exercise range anywhere from about 8 to 12 reps. And lastly, in terms of tension or the speed with which you're doing exercises is generally quite slow. A very important component of hypertrophy training is what we call time under tension, or the amount of time that a muscle is active. For hypertrophy training, you want high time under tension, so you're going to be doing slow, controlled movements through a full available range of motion. When we're differentiating between different types of resistance training, rest is also a very important component, because it influences what your body is using to produce energy. So when we discuss hypertrophy training, generally speaking, the rest periods are quite short, anywhere between 30 to 60 seconds, and this is going to promote muscle maintenance and muscle growth.
All right, now I'd like to talk about strength training in particular. So when we talk about strength training, it's basically increasing our body's ability to lift heavier objects. So when we're training specifically in a strength training phase, we're going to be generally focusing on lifting heavier loads, so close to maximal ability, and we're going to be taking fairly long rest periods, usually about 3 to 5 minutes. So this is very important so that our bodies can reach full recovery before our next set. When we're considering strength training, for a rep scheme, we're usually going to be aiming towards the lower end of the spectrum, normally about 2 to 5 repetitions. And a critical thing to maintain is our form and technique during our movements, as when we start lifting heavier loads, we tend to start sacrificing our technique and our form just to be able to move the weight, but it's very, very critical to maintain our posture. Lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about endurance training. So what endurance training is basically teaching our body how to lift weights for a longer period of time. So when we're training in an endurance phase, we're going to be doing a higher rep scheme, so usually between 12 to 15 reps, and we're going to be having a shorter rest period, so usually about 30 seconds or less. What that's going to do, it's going to allow our bodies to learn how to lift a heavier weight for a longer period of time. So as we talked about last week when we were doing aerobic training or cardiovascular training, it was kind of the same scenario. So we're actually teaching our body how to aerobically move weight for a longer period of time. Now I'm just going to touch upon what we like to call periodization. So what that is basically the amount of time that you're going to spend in each phase of training. So for example, this is just a year-long progression. Say this is January, and this is December. Okay, so for example, if you've gone through the basics of learning how to work out and you've developed a little bit of an adaptation to resistance training already, for example, if we start our training block in January, we're generally going to work in a 4 to 6 week block cycle. So for example, say in January we start hypertrophy training. So if we start hypertrophy training in January, we're going to have a 4 to 6 week training block of hypertrophy training. So this in here is all going to be hypertrophy training. So then after hypertrophy training, we've developed some muscle mass, and we actually want to teach that muscle how to be stronger. We're going to start doing a strength training phase. So say for example our next 4 weeks becomes our strength training. So we're actually teaching this new muscle that we've gained how to become stronger and move more weight. So this phase here is our strength phase. So as you can see, throughout the year, you're going to want to kind of block your training a little bit. So if you're an endurance athlete or someone who just wants to do things for longer, you would, for example, say, okay, I want to get stronger and I want to get more muscle mass so that I can teach it how to do things for a longer period of time. So if I'm needing to carry boxes upstairs or something like that, you want to develop the strength and the muscle mass to do that, and then teach it how to do it over a longer period of time. So we would then move into, for example, say an endurance phase, teaching it how to move that mass for a longer period of time. So for this in general, the phase that you follow is going to be specific to yourself, and if your main goal is strength, you might kind of say reverse it and say have endurance here, then hypertrophy, and then finish off with strength at a specific time that you need to be super strong. That will conclude our resistance training video. Thanks everyone for watching this video and for following us throughout this program.
We really hope that you not only learned a little bit from it, but became a little bit mindful of your body and how you're moving. We hope that you really benefited from at least a few of the videos. We really enjoyed making them.
And we hope that you guys take a little bit away from it and consider it throughout the rest of your lives.